Podcast Revolution by Accident. Ladies and gentlemen, I would welcome David Tvrdon to the stage to talk to us about this amazing topic. He is a journalist and podcast producer. David, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Okay, let's go. So, if you want the link to the speech, here it is, like the presentation. I already tweeted it out. As I also included some resources. So, if there is like someone who wants to, go deep on podcasting, there will be some things you can click later on and so stuff like that. So it's here, and it's also on my Twitter account. I tweeted it out. Okay, let's start first with this question. Where should I put this? Okay. So, who here knows about podcasts and is listening to podcasts? By show of hands, please. Okay, so let's say a majority of the audience. So, for the other part of you who maybe don't know, podcast is an on-demand audio form. So think about podcasting as you would think maybe about a newsletter, right? You stumble upon a newsletter, you like it, you subscribe to it, and then always when someone puts out a new, newsletter, you will get it on your email. But with podcasts, it's the same. You just need a podcasting app. Then someone will, you will stumble upon a podcast, you'll subscribe, and you will get the podcast the next time the new episode comes out just automatically. So podcasts are based on this, like you could say, ancient digital technology RSS feeds. So that's a podcast. Now, 3 years ago in Slovakia, we had this chicken and egg problem. I'm sure you know the old Greek philosopher. I think it was Plutarch. Doesn't matter. It was a Greek philosopher who had this question like, okay, so we know every chicken comes from an egg and every egg comes from a chicken, but which was first, the chicken or an egg? And the same question I have been asking my bosses at our news site was like, for years we've been talking about like, okay, there's podcasting going on in US, in UK, all around the world, but they didn't want to let us like make a podcast. And the question was like, okay, but there are no podcasts in Slovakia, so no one is listening to podcasts. So should the people come to us and say, oh, you should do podcasts, and then we will do podcasts, or should we start doing podcasts? Wait, what happens? And then maybe people will be listening. So we started with the chicken and we made the podcast, and actually it caught on. I'll talk about it more. Another question I get really frequently is, can you make money on podcasting? Yes, you can. And how? I'll show you. So in 2017, we started doing our podcast. It was daily news, so we actually copied what the New York Times or the NPR was doing in the United States. And you can see that in 2018 and 2019, the number of podcasts actually originating in Slovakia started to really rising up. And it's still like new podcast in Slovakia now pops up, I would say, every week, a new one. This is actually the number of downloads or streams of how many people are, how many downloads and streams our podcasts have. And you can see it's been rising since then, since we started doing it in the end of 2017. Today, more than 100,000 people are listening just to our podcast from our news site. But there are other news sites and other, independent producers who do their own podcast. So it's really rising. That's why I'm talking about the podcast revolution. Now, why I'm talking about an accident? Because we started it by a chance, by an experiment. Me and my friends and my colleagues, we were bugging our friend, the management of the newsroom, and we were like, oh, let's start doing this podcast thing. The New York Times started doing it. Are we worse than New York Times? And we thought, no, we can do it the same way as they did. Well, maybe with less people. Maybe the same way as you compared the TikTok of Delphi to Washington Post. And so we started doing it. So what we did, we looked at what was going on in the world, and we said, okay, let's try to copy that thing they are doing, and we will bring it to our audiences. So basically, we started doing a daily news podcast, which there was like coming out daily. We had one host who will have one guest. The guest is always a journalist. They will have only one topic. They will talk about the topic for 15 to 20 minutes. There will be like a short news briefing in the beginning of the podcast, and also a weather forecast. And for some reason, our audience demanded that we also tell whose name day it is every day. So now we have 13 podcasts. We diversified. We have like all kinds of shows, from history shows to tech news to economics, business. We had a feminist podcast, which was actually, to my surprise, quite popular as well. And we went from 0 to 7 hours of audio production in 1 week. So how we started this was basically we took one guy who was our cameraman, the video producer, and we told him, like, we don't need as much video, so you don't have, so much work. So let's try to do this, podcasting thing. And actually, he really loved it, and he's not doing videos anymore, just podcasts. So maybe that's one way. Take a video guy and turn him into an audio producer. Now, why am I talking about this? When you look at the stats, how much people read your content online. So this is what turned out for us. On the website, on digital, our articles are read, by average in one, that's 1 week. So in 1 week, average user reads our articles for 20 minutes. So they spend 20 minutes with our content. But an average podcast listener spends 3 hours with our content. That's a huge amount of time they're dedicating to our content. That means also we have like a better relationship with them. Our readers are older white men in general, not only, but in general. But with podcasts, you look at them, and we have done some research, and we have seen like, okay, this is a younger audience. They are super highly educated, and they are super engaged. That's why they are listening for hours to our content. That means they like the content. It's on demand, so they can choose when they listen to it, and it actually works for them because we are trying to do it as good as we can. So we've done this survey on almost 2,000 people last year. And no, it was this year, and we found out okay, so most of the podcast listeners are below 35 years. There are some older ones, but we see nice traction among the young people. So that was one thing we found out. Then another thing, they are highly educated. Most of them have university degrees. And another thing was they listen almost daily or several times a week to our content. Again, very nice stats. Now, where do they listen to podcasts? So we found out many people listen to podcasts at home. We were asking, where do you listen to podcasts? And they say, while I'm brushing my teeth, while I'm showering, while I sit on the toilet in the morning, and things like that. Then the second, was while commute, while they're going to work, or some of them listen at work while they're, work out, while they walk. So you see this medium, this podcast medium, they can listen to it wherever they like, and they are usually doing something else while they're, listening to the podcast. That means could you read an article of our website or Delphi in your shower? Probably, but not the best, thing to do. Could you do it on your commute? Yes, you can, but then again, maybe, it's not the most convenient thing to do when the bus is full of other people. But with podcasts, you just plug in your earplugs and you listen. I'm sure it's same for Latvia as it is for Slovakia, that 80% of the people who have mobile phones are Android. Yes, okay. But the most people who are listening to podcasts have iPhones. So that means there's a small percentage of those people also in Slovakia, but because podcasting app on iPhones is so dominant. So if you buy a new iPhone, there you have the icon of the Apple Podcasts app. It's so easy for people to discover this medium. With Android users, we struggle a little bit because always our listeners come to us like, what kind of app should I use for listening to podcasts on Android? Well, you have the Google Podcast app, which is a little bit, they're still developing it, let's say, but it's out there. It's getting some traction. But we see like many people on Android listen through Spotify. Spotify is actually a very nice platform for podcast listeners. So you have young people there. People already are listening to audio on that app, which makes it like even easier to, you want to have a break and listen not just to music, but also maybe to some news or some shows or something, which will educate you. There you have the podcast. And also what we see, people are listening, they come to your website, there is an audio player, and they listen to the podcast like that. Not many people, but we have like older audiences who do it like this. They're used to the website, they come to the website, and they listen to the podcast on the website. Doesn't matter for us. But obviously, you want to get people to subscribe, so that's why it's better to them to tell them always. We tell in the podcast, like, okay, I like it that you're listening to this podcast, but it will be easier for you in the future to get new episodes if you subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or there are like hundreds of podcasting apps you can use. So here you can see the majority is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, other. That other means like lots of other podcasting apps, Pocket Cast, Overcast, millions of them. And some people listen on the web. And yes, as I told you, Spotify is really on the rise. So there are some, there has been some research done. Actually, there are also already countries in Europe where Spotify is like more people listen to podcasts on Spotify than on Apple Podcasts. Another data which might interest you is 90% on average of the podcast is listened to. So that means if someone starts listening to your podcast, 90% of the time they will go through the whole thing till the end. This almost never happens with video or articles, at least not on our website. But with podcasts it does. So how can you make money with podcasting? Okay, so there are, so this is actually us. We went from like 0 to 5 figures in 2 years. So it was kind of an investment, but it's slowly getting traction. I hope it will be like even higher next year. Now, research in Europe, in the US says digital audio is $1 billion market or billion euro market by 2023. Of course, this is not only podcasting, but all digital audio, but still you can see the trend is there. So, how you can make money on podcasting? You use ads, just like radio ads, but not just like a radio ad. The podcasting app, the podcasting ads should be a little bit different. People are used to, you have to think about it. So now this person is listening to my podcast on demand. I want them to listen always. So, for example, when companies come to us and they say, oh, we have this, radio ad, and we want to put that radio ad into your podcast, we're actually vetting that. So we listen to the ad and we say, no, this is too aggressive. Because when you listen to radio, the ad has to be, something that will really make you focus on the ad. In the podcasting, it's not that way. You should have the ad which is like more, I would say, user-friendly. Sponsorships, so you can have like companies which sponsor your podcast, or you can do like a whole episode for a company. So let's say we had an episode with a head of a bank because they wanted to do something, but then again it was transparent. We said like, yes, this is paid for by that and that, but we had there a real journalist who was asking real questions. Also, another way you can make money is, let's say there's a company, but they don't want to, interview within your podcast, and they say like, okay, I want the whole podcast. So there are actually agencies in the US, in the UK, maybe in Europe some, I'm not sure, which are actually producing podcasts for these businesses. For example, Facebook has its own podcast, which is produced by Pacific Content, which is a agency for podcast production. Actually, what we are doing also is we are advertising our digital subscription through podcast, and guess what? It's working. People actually go and buy our digital subscriptions because we told them this is a way how you can support this podcast, this is a way how you can support our site. So we just say like, go to this URL. We always say a short URL so that we can track the user, and it actually works. And not just for us, we have seen other news media in Slovakia who have digital content, and they say like, yeah, we gain actually hundreds of subscribers through the podcast. You can do events, live shows. We actually did a small campaign on merchandising. So we did produce these mugs, and they had the logo of the podcast, and it actually works. And what we did also was we were selling the mugs with digital subscriptions. Again, something which maybe wouldn't be your first option, but people actually bought the mugs with the digital subscription. You can do training. So there are a lot of ways, even more ways which I didn't mention here. When we did a survey, 75% of the people said they don't mind ads. Podcast listeners actually understand, okay, this is a way how you can support the podcast, and this is a way how your podcast stays for free. So there are also podcasts which are paid for. You only get it if you pay for it. Not many of them, but the good thing is the listeners actually understand. So if we did the same thing on our website, and do you like the ads we have on our website? Well, many people, I'm not going to tell you the number, but you can see on your websites. So the answer is basically how many people use ad blockers. That actually tells you how many people like your ads. Okay, here was a nice study done by Reuters Institute, and they said like, okay, we see voice like the future of technology in means of, how you connect with it. So maybe you have a smart speaker at home. Maybe you talk to your television for some reason. I didn't mean it like that. But basically, those people who use voice control, they have found out that it's harder for them to come back to another way to communicate with the technology. Okay, so a few more things before I wrap up. These are the top shows for us. So daily news, history, tech news, interviews. I really recommend, if you're thinking about doing a podcast, not to do it just for your voice or one person, but people are very keen on listening to interviews. It's the same as in radio. That's nothing new. But again, there are some people who think, oh, maybe I'll do a podcast. I'll do it by myself in the bedroom, and I'll just talk to the microphone, put it out. And we have seen some independent podcasters who have done this actually, and then they emailed me. Not many people are listening to my podcast. Then I listened to the podcast, and it was just this one guy in his bedroom talking to the microphone for 30 minutes, and it was boring. I'm sorry. If you can do it, great. But interviews, conversation is always better. Science show, travel shows. So this is for us. Now, something more interesting. When you take, there was a research done by Voxnest, an agency who are doing like podcast ads and so on, and they find out like in US and Europe these are the top revenue generating categories. So this means like if you have a podcast like this, you will get companies working. They're looking for this kind of content: sports, culture, history, technology, less politics, more comedy, and history. Actually, there are few podcasts which are done by stand-up comedians in Slovakia, and they're very, very popular. They actually have set up the Patreon account, and they have hundreds of and thousands of people actually paying them for supporting them to do more episodes. Okay. So lessons learned. Be the chicken. Money will follow when you build an audience. We have started with nothing. We have invested in it, and then actually in the beginning, it was us going to different companies like, okay, let's try this thing, podcasting. Not many people listening to it now, but you see, just support us. And now we have companies coming to us because we have so many listeners. You go for the subscribers, tell the people, subscribe to our podcast. So in the beginning, when we started doing podcasts, more than half of the audience was coming to our website and just clicking on the article and listening to the podcast via an audio player embedded in the article. But we were telling them, subscribe, it will be easier for you, and people actually did it, and they liked it, and we have less website, listeners, and it's better for us because we know they're subscribed and they're loyal. Since we started, we've been always telling, okay, so these are the numbers, how many people are listening, how many podcast downloads we have, and it actually worked because the audience was curious how many people are listening, so you want to know who's listening to this weird thing, podcasting, and also it was good for advertisers, and again and again, people don't know what is podcasting. You have to have it in your mind. Like, it's not like everyone knows what a podcast is, so you have to explain again and again and again and again and again. Here are the resources I included, so you can find it on the link, and thank you for your attention.
Yes. Thank you so much, David. Thank you. Please, do we have any questions for David? Any questions at all? No? Okay, David, I want to ask you actually, what is your inspiration for podcasting? How did you get into it? What is it?
Honestly, I don't remember. I've been listening to podcasts for 10 years now, maybe, and I just really wanted to do it in my newsroom as well. So it's like, a hobby that turned out to be a good business.
Okay. We have questions, yes.
As you know, I was working in radio business. So the figures when you show where people are listening to podcasts actually the same as in radio business. The question is, did you have some kind of study? Do people listen to podcasts, or they just switch it on and go to make their homeworks, and after that they understood that they actually didn't listen to that just couple minutes from all these 30 minutes and 6, and after that this is a problem with advertisers, because actually they're saying, it's not working.
No, so actually it is, as I told in the beginning, it's on demand. So when you listen to a radio, it's usually you drive, there's something on the radio, or you go to a restaurant, the radio is on. Sometimes there's music, sometimes there are, the radio hosts talking, but you don't really care. It's like a background noise, sorry. But with podcasts, we see people are listening to the podcast because, for example, the history show we have, it's like almost like episodic, so like there is something going on and there's like more parts, and also with the daily news show, it's actually, people are like super listening, because if we do a small fuck up, so for example, when we're editing the podcast, we are including, so it's usually a conversation, but we try to include, when a politician says something, we include that clip. And sometimes the audio producers, they forget, right? So there's like 10 seconds of silence or 5 seconds of silence. And right away, people will tell us like what happened there? And also we have set up a Facebook group where we communicate with our audience, and we're getting instant feedback on what they like, what they don't like. People email us, so the feedback is actually really strong. We really see that people are listening to it. Actually, my colleagues have also done a research, like if people remember when there was like an ad in the podcast, if they listen to it, and it turned out yes, they listened, they remember what kind of ad it was. So I really see the big difference between doing something that's like you don't really know what you will be listening to. People don't really check the radio schedule anymore, but with podcasting you decide, yes, I'm going to listen to this, I want to hear it. So for example, my wife didn't listen to podcasts, right? I didn't make her. she started listening to them, and then she said, sometimes when we listen to a podcast together, and she just like forgets, like you go somewhere and for 10 seconds she didn't listen, she actually goes back and replays that part which she didn't listen to. You cannot do that with radio.
Hey,
Hi.
your news site is based on written articles, and
Yes.
the biggest part of your journalists also was recruited for writing. How easy it was to convince them to come and speak, for example, in those interviews when you speak about daily news and podcasts? Were there any struggles, or did it go just like, okay, I will go, I will speak, I will tell everything what happened in Parliament today?
So actually, surprisingly, it was easy because there was no camera. So we actually took the journalist who would never go in front of a camera and speak about something they have written about. But when we took them to a audio, like a radio audio studio, they had no problem talking about the thing they were reporting in written news in their articles. So it was actually like quite easy.
I have a question. How do you teach a grandmother how to listen to podcasts? I think they're a brilliant audience. They have all this time in the world. They could listen to all the podcasts. But how do you teach them? Because you said about teaching in the end.
So actually, what we have seen, our audience, what they does, they love the podcast so much that they teach their family how to listen to the podcast. So they come to their parents, to their grandparents, they set up the app and they say like, okay, so if you want to listen to a new, episode, you do this and this and this.
So a podcast about listening to podcasts.
No.
A podception.
Almost. No, basically, our listeners are spreading the word. So we got loyal listeners, and they are actually spreading how to, listen to a podcast.
Yes. Thank you so much, David.
A round of
Thank you.
applause.